Hello, wildlings. I'm your Creepsmith, and you found my Fear Forge. Lucky you.
Today's story, Part 2 of I Took a Factory Job. What's Happening in the Cornfields? By Mr. Outlaw. I suppose that this will serve as a follow-up to my original post. I've realized some stuff. Things that weren't immediately apparent, but after a bit of introspection seem quite disconcerting. For instance, Winston is weird. Not personality-wise, though. I don't really know what to call it. In a metaphysical sense, maybe? He's always there when I am. I don't have consistent hours either. I mean, they range from 6 to 10 hours per day, but they usually aren't in the same window of time. What I mean by that is that sometimes I could be working 9 to 5, other days I could go from 7 a.m. to 2 p.m. or 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. See what I mean? The thing is, Winston's always there, both when I clock in and when I clock out. Unless he inexplicably has the same exact hours as me, not likely for a man of his position, this is not normal. But there could still be an explanation for this. Maybe he's a workaholic. Those exist, don't they? But I just don't see anybody working that much. I met up with Sergio at a bar after work one day. We've gotten quite close by now. And we started discussing this. Now, I had just finished an 11 to 8 shift, and Sergio had essentially just woken up after finishing one from 1 a.m. to 10 a.m. Could you guess what he told me? Winston was there with him the whole time. He was also there the whole time for me, 1 a.m. to 8 p.m. That's 19 hours. Don't tell me that anybody works 19 hours a day. And what was weirder was that after all this time, we weren't exactly sure what Winston even did at the factory. I mean, he really didn't spend that much time in his office. He'd either be walking around the ground floor, going up to the second floor, or simply disappearing completely somewhere in the back, only to come back a few hours later. Now, I'd never worked a managerial position, not in this kind of business, so I can't say for sure what he should have been doing, but it sure as hell must involve phone calls or paperwork or something. But he never seemed to be doing that. Our conversation moved on to other things that we found questionable about our respective situations. I told him about the inventory room and the man in the suit, but I have to admit those paled in comparison to what he told me. He was having a smoke by his car one day when he saw a woman come out of the factory, seemingly bawling her eyes out. He called to her, but she just ignored him and continued running away right into an adjacent cornfield. He decided to go after her, see if she was okay. After a few minutes of trying to track her through the crops, he stumbled into a clearing. There was a singular, run-down shack in the middle. He could still hear the woman crying. So with his guard all the way up, he walks in there. And he finds the woman crouched in the corner, seemingly looking for something on the floor. He calls out to her, "Excuse me, ma'am, you all right?" She turns around, face absolutely drenched in tears. "Who are you? Just go away." A few seconds later, she pushes downwards onto this little section of the floor, revealing a set of stairs. Before she climbs down, she turns around to face him and says, "Don't look at the man in black." And just like that, she's gone. The floor returns to its original form, and Sergio is left standing there alone, not knowing what to think. He didn't try investigating further. He considered mentioning it to Winston, although that never came to fruition. But here's the really fucked up part. That woman was back at work the very next day. Sergio said that they made brief eye contact, but that there was no reciprocation of any familiarity in her stare. And again, he thought about talking to her about it, but he didn't. There was another instance where he wanted to talk to Winston about changing one of his shifts. Now, since Sergio couldn't find him anywhere, he tried his office. He knew that someone was in there because he could hear what sounded like a muffled conversation through the door. He furrowed his brow as he continued with the next part. It was muffled, he said, a bit too much. Anyhow, he knocked on the door for several minutes, but nobody bothered to answer. In fact, the conversation seemed to be getting louder with every knock. At some point, he simply walked away. He bumped into Winston a few minutes later, of course. He wasn't terribly surprised. I mean, there was a tangible explanation for something like this. Some supervisors from a different branch could have been using his office for some kind of meeting, but that didn't seem to be the case. Sergio told him that he'd tried knocking, assuming that Winston was in his office, but the guys inside never answered. He told me that Winston's face instantly morphed into one of horrific anger upon hearing this. How many did it sound like there were in there? Was his immediate response to it. Sergio answered with, a couple, and Winston took off, storming out. Now that sounds familiar, doesn't it? But that wasn't even his worst experience. That came on one of his night shifts. It was about 3 a.m. and he was getting ready to leave after a strenuous 10 hours of loading trucks. At that point, the place was pretty empty. He started heading out toward his car when he spotted something out of the corner of his eye. It was partially obscured by the cornfield, but it looked like a person. Obviously, the features were pretty much impossible to distinguish from that distance and at that time in the darkness, but he told me that it almost looked like the person was wearing a mask. They briefly stared at each other before the figure started fucking running towards him. Sergio freaked out and bolted toward his car. He got in, fumbling around for his keys before finally managing to stick one in the ignition. But by that time, the person had caught up to him. He said that they launched themselves onto the hood of his truck and cracked his windshield. That's when he got a better look at the guy. Now, he couldn't exactly tell whether or not the guy was wearing a blank mask or if he had no face. I mean, again, it was dark. He told himself to believe the former. Sergio, he was in sheer shock, unable to function or even think. This person started banging on his windshield, producing more cracks, but also a bit of blood. It was at this point where a group of extremely large men in security gear came out of nowhere specific and yanked the guy off Sergio's car. One of them told Serge to sit still while the others dragged the attacker away, back into the cornfield. They told Sergio that they were the nighttime security for the factory, and that the man who'd charged at him was a mental patient that escaped from a nearby hospital. But there's two things wrong with that statement, he told me. First off, there is no nighttime security. I've worked these shifts before. You'd think I would have seen him by now. Second, there is no mental hospital, not within 500 miles of here. So who the hell was that guy? During his following shift, Winston came up to him, apologized for the incident, and told him that he'd personally pay out of pocket for his windshield repairs, but he didn't seem to want to answer any questions about what had happened. All this just from a few weeks working here. So Why don't you just leave? This shit is beyond fucked up, I told him as we were getting ready to depart. He responded by giving me a solemn-sounding chuckle. I think it'll be all right. I mean, it has to be. I got no other options. Nobody else is gonna hire me after what I've done. In the kindest possible way, I tried asking him what that was. Something bad, was his only reply. I guess that was a subtle message for me not to press any further with it. It's weird. During the entire time we were sitting at the bar, I could have sworn that somebody was watching us. I couldn't narrow it down to a single person or anything I saw that made me think that, but the feeling was there nonetheless. That feeling persisted on my walk home. But this time, I could see him. It was a man, hood up and head down, as he trailed me. I stopped, turned, getting ready to confront him, but he simply brushed by me. But not before slipping a piece of paper into my hand. On it was a phone number and a message. The Dolus Company isn't real. Call me. When I got home, I considered doing exactly that, but I couldn't come to a personal consensus. I mean, what if calling him would only introduce additional problems? I decided to refrain from doing so, for the time being at least. When I clocked into work the next day, I was approached by Winston right away. He called me into his office, gushed about how great an employee I'd been, and offered me a $3 an hour raise. I was absolutely incredulous at this. I mean, he had literally caught me dicking around on multiple occasions, reading. None of this made any sense, but I just thanked him and went right along with it. During my break, I decided to send the guy who had bumped into me a text, but he never responded. After work, I decided to give him a call, but I was directed to an automated voice stating that the number was no longer in service. Things are getting weird here. Trying to find a method to the madness of this place seems like a daunting and, admittedly, horrifying task. But I'll stick around for now. Maybe look a bit further into this. I mean, hell, maybe the Dolus Company isn't real, but the money sure is. I think I'll talk to Chad next, see what he has to say. But when things get weird, that's when they get fun. Isn't it, wildlings? Be back next time for when we figure out what else is going on and maybe, just maybe, a little bit of what's behind it. Until then, stay scary and make the most of your nights.